Okay, it's time for a transition to our first panel. And our moderator for this panel is Sophia Rabe-Hesketh, one of the members of the steering committee for this whole project.
Okay, hi. So it's a pleasure to briefly introduce the four speakers for this panel, and I would also like to thank Amy Berman for getting all this organized and getting all these distinguished people to come and present. Okay, so the chair of the panel is David Figlio, and he's director of the Institute for Policy Research and Orrington Lund Professor of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. He coordinates the National Science Foundation network on the use of administrative data to improve education research and policy. And as well as being the chair, he will give a presentation on the uses of administrative data in education research. And then next up is Eric Hanushek, who is the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. He's been a leader in the development of economic analysis of educational issues, such as class size reduction, high-stakes accountability, and value-added assessments of teacher quality. And his presentation will be on big data, privacy, and educational improvement. And then we will hear from Larry Hedges, who's a Board of Trustees professor at Northwestern University and has appointments in the Department of Statistics, the Department of Psychology, the School of Education and Social Policy, and the Institute for Policy Research. He's best known for his work on meta-analysis and its application to evidence-based policy, and he will talk about using big data in education. And then finally, we'll hear from Chris Chapman, the Associate Commissioner for the Sample Surveys Division of NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, where he has worked for nearly 20 years. He will speak about the integration of administrative record and sample survey data at NCES. Okay, so my intention was to be very brief to give time for the speakers. Thank you.
Well, this is the best chair job ever because I don't actually have to be the person to yank people from speaking. So thanks to the organizers for bringing us together. It's really it's terrific to be here. My purpose, task for this, the next 15 minutes was to provide mostly the pros of this discussion, some of the pros of this discussion. So Andy was really great in terms of helping also to set up a lot of the promise. We'll leave it to some other people to talk about the pitfalls as well. In case you're interested in this specific piece, Chris Karbovnik and Chel Sylvanas and I have written a handbook chapter, which was for the handbook of education economics, just was published. Because it was written for an economics handbook, all of the examples in that handbook chapter are in the economics world, but I think that most of the lessons are universal. And so if you're interested in this, then you can read a long paper with lots and lots of citations. There's been, as we've seen and all been talking about, there's extraordinary and exponential improvements that have been occurring over the last several decades in terms of data storage and computing capacity. It's now possible to collect and manage and analyze data in magnitudes and manners inconceivable a short time ago. I'm 45 years old, so I have caught only a portion of this massive wave. But whenever I have graduate students who come to complain about certain types of things, I bring out my history of all the different media with which I've used. By the way, these were anonymized, de-identified data that I could just use as relics now, like mag tapes that I used and zip disks and old floppies, and each one of these things were the cutting edge but I didn't use punch cards. So some of my more esteemed colleagues can talk about those examples. And now it's our little computers in our pockets. Please turn them off, by the way. Those little computers can do things that are orders of magnitude more powerful and have orders of magnitude more storage capacity than the things that we dreamed about when many of us were writing our dissertations and the like. With this huge capacity, governments have developed large-scale comprehensive data files on all sorts of different topics. Again, Andy was discussing some of these things, from education, health, benefit program, workforce, taxes, et cetera. The U.S. Department of Education, thank you, has invested $750 million to date and more to help states build, populate, and maintain education data, but the data are not designed in a manner that makes them readily accessible and available for scholarly activity, and there's lots of problems and challenges with that. So a good way to start here is just to talk about the fact that administrative data are not a panacea, right? Administrative data are wonderful in many dimensions, but they're limited to certain locations. This can decrease generalizability. My colleague and co-panelist Larry Hedges actually has spent a lot of time of late discussing precisely this issue and ways in which one can deal with it. I'm suspecting he's going to talk a bit about that very, very soon. They often measure variables that are conducive to program administration, because that's the definition of administrative data, but they're not always ideal for research purposes. They're not always structured in a manner that ensures certain aspects of data quality that can be seen in, say, purpose-built research data sets that, again, the U.S. Department of Education is, and other agencies have spent a lot of time building over the years. But at the same time, there's a huge number of clear advantages for empirical research using administrative data in education, and that's what I want to spend the next 2 minutes talking about. There's a huge number of benefits of using population-level data per se, which administrative data are particularly well-suited for doing. One is statistical power. A lot of times people almost have a I guess I'm going to go there, a cultish fascination with effect sizes. Well, effect sizes are great in a lot of ways, but many people think, okay, well here, a big effect size good, small effect size bad. Well, I'm an economist. If there's one thing that economics can contribute as a discipline to this whole discussion, it would be this notion of thinking about cost-benefit analyses. And I would much rather implement policies and practices with relatively small effect sizes if they cost pennies on the dollar to something that might have a larger effect size but cost orders and orders of magnitudes more money, for example, or at least we should have that conversation. Well, how are we going to differentiate between effect sizes and statistical significance, which is another type of thing? Well, having big data sets, now I'm not talking about big data, well, you know what I mean, right? Having these large data sets with large numbers of observations allows us to statistically detect small effect sizes that might be highly relevant. In addition to trying to statistically detect small effect sizes that might be really valuable for us, we also want to detect rare events that might be useful for causal identification. When we start these purpose-built data sets, we're not anticipating what something might happen down the road. Some jurisdiction might do something down the road, for example. There may be a natural disaster. There may be something wonderful. All sorts of different things might happen if you have administrative data sets and rare occurrences that are either good or bad. That could be really valuable for analysis. Related to that, we are able to study natural experiments that would be impossible to anticipate, impossible to study prospectively. We can study heterogeneous effects of educational policies and practices. One of the things we're learning more and more and more about as in this room and around the profession is that one size doesn't fit all for education. Well, if one size doesn't fit all, and there are sometimes certain types of individuals under certain circumstances who benefit differentially by different practices, we want to be able to understand that heterogeneity. we can lower the cost of conducting RCTs by virtue of the fact that it's sometimes very, very difficult to follow up with, over long periods of time with RCTs. By supercharging administrative data with the potential for RCTs with the potential for matching with administrative follow-up. One can link administrative data across domains. Some of the work that I do, for example, involves this interplay between health and education. One of the things that my colleagues and I have been learning, this is the only time I'll talk about my own research here in this talk, is that early health is a necessary condition for certain aspects of later cognitive development, for example. And we also know that the reverse is true, that there's a strong reverse relationship between human capital and health. Well, if we want, then this suggests that we may make real breakthroughs in terms of educational policies and practice by understanding this relationship between health and education. We can better I'm not a structural person, but many of us in different disciplines, economics, sociology, psychology, et cetera, do like to estimate structural parameters of human behavior. For people who are structural people, this is another real advantage of population level data. There are other advantages of administrative data that go beyond the notion of just its population level. We have novel types of variables that are typically not found in non-administrative data that is possible to see. You can look at things like changing geographical locations. That's one of the pieces about the Chetty Friedman type of work that Andy was talking about. Social networks, health instances that are hard to study otherwise, delinquency. These are all examples of types of variables that usually we can't measure or as well, but are collected administratively. The real-time nature of administrative data allows us to study policies and practices that are very recent. I spend a lot of time talking with policymakers and practitioners in state and local education agencies. And one of the real frustrations that policymakers and practitioners have is that they want to know answers about what's going on right in their jurisdictions right now. And researchers are often saying, well, in 15 years, we can tell you how that thing that you want to know the answer to right now is happening. Administrative data helps to accelerate that process to some degree. The archival nature at the same time of administrative data allows us to study that same question for things that happened in the past. And so they also then permit the opportunity to study intergenerational issues. Again, this is another thing across all different social science disciplines. We're starting to understand more and more the importance of intergenerational questions in terms of human capital and educational outcomes. Recall bias. It's much less sensitive to recall bias than retrospective reporting. I use data from the state of Florida a lot. When people enroll their children in kindergarten, they ask in the state of Florida, they're asked, what type of preschool arrangement did your child have last year? It turns out that a non-trivial fraction of people who the state says they were enrolled in a preschool program in this very school just last year don't remember that. Now, let's think about what happens then if we're asked to say, remember something that happened to you or your child 20 years ago. I do this for a living. I was just filling out this stuff as I'm enrolling my kid for college, and I forgot some of those things. And I mean, it's my job, right? I mean, other people's job, it's not. I mean, that's another problem. Administrative data is a little bit of a truth serum in that regard, too. And of course, it's much less likely to suffer from attrition or non-response bias because somebody might decide they don't want to keep filling out responding to a survey. For instance, the NLSY, which is a workhorse for a lot of labor economists, for example, by the time you get 20 years out, only 75% of people are still responding to the survey. Only 75%, that's amazing for survey response for 20 years out. Well, guess how many people are still in the administrative data if you're following them over time? It's a much higher percentage. And so these types of things are also very valuable. Okay, and then I say all this and low cost too. There are huge economies of scale once data structures are established. Adding more research projects imposes relatively low programming and support storage costs for state and local and federal education agencies. When they're used in conjunction with survey data, they can help to improve the efficiency of surveys related to the thing I was talking about with regard to the RCCs. If you're using them in conjunction with field experiments, they lower tracking and follow-up costs dramatically. I'm not saying that administrative data should supplant these different types of data sets, but they can augment in ways that I guess I'm using my little soapbox here to help the state. I have about 1 minute left, so I'll talk about challenges. Purpose-built survey data have much more flexibility because they're purpose-built for a specific purpose, right? Administrative data have less flexibility in certain dimensions. There are technical issues associated with the use of administrative registers. Sometimes there aren't good mechanisms for linking data across domains, across time, longitudinally, et cetera, following people. There are still issues with attrition, especially if you're looking, say, within jurisdictions. I do work in the state of Florida. Sometimes people leave the state of Florida to go somewhere else. My kid is in my data. She now has been living in, I can't identify her, by the way, but she's been living in Illinois for 8 years. So she's an attriter, and there's nothing we can do about it. They're often not particularly well documented. I do a lot of documentation actually back with for the state and local education agencies with which I work. And of course, the topic of a lot of this conversation, the political issues related to anonymity. So in my last 10 seconds, there's a bunch of stuff to read here. Administrative data present a world of opportunity. The benefits of these data and using them for research and policy purposes surely outweigh the costs. There are opportunities for cost-effective breakthroughs in analysis. They prevent new research questions, overturning of conventional wisdom through new research designs, more data-driven policymakers. So the last thing I'll mention here is it's in the best interest of science, policy, and practice to make good use of administrative data while following best practices in data security and ethics, and furthering partnerships and trust relationships between all of the relevant entities will benefit taxpayers, policymakers, and scholars alike. And so it's up to the rest of you speakers to discuss how we're going to make that so. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I'll start by saying that I thought Andrew's paper was great, and so if you haven't read it, you should read it. I've gone through David's chapter in quite some detail in the past, and so we'll just stipulate what part of this statement is from David's paper, and that is that we've learned amazing things in the short time that we've been using large-scale administrative data, and it's changed many views of the world by having actual data on them. So I'm going to stipulate all that and try to bring up some topics that I think weren't explicit, they're implicit in Andrew's paper, but topics that I think we have to discuss over the next day and a half. So I'm going to start with what I call the researcher's value function, which I think is, I'm going to assert that Andrew has, I'm going to admit that I have, and that is, with limited resources, you want to optimize what you do with your expenditures. The administrative data permits in a number of circumstances, with caveats here and there, to evaluate program results. And then the value of administrative data is it allows you to do better things. You can either take the current amount of expenditures and improve the performance, or you can get the current performance at lower cost, one way or the other. And then the final statement is, well, what we want to do is just compare the cost savings or the value from the research part to the potential cost of a breach of privacy. So that's, I think, is the underlying implicit model, and Andrew can disagree if he wants. That's my underlying model of when I do all this research in this area. But I think that there's the politician's value function that may differ. In particular, I think the starting point of most politicians that I know is we want to do better ceteris paribus. And the question is, what else is being held constant? The normal statement then goes from, well, it's valuing the improvement that you get is really kind of complicated because researchers understate the amount of uncertainty that's involved and sort of puff up the conclusions from individual specific studies. There are political aspects to programmatic choices. For example, we have a large proportion of our state governors today you would call education governors. They have a position on education. They often have policies that they advertise when they're running for office as being the way to solve all of our educational problems. And the last thing they want to hear is that their policies are dumb. You know, and so there are these political aspects to evaluating programs. And then, it was brought up before, there are some stakeholder preferences. In particular, some of the people that work in schools are not interested in knowing the outcomes of their schooling situation at all. They would rather not. That includes some of the people that organize the people who work in schools. So I think that the final thing on the politician's value statement is that researchers, in the eyes of politicians, tend to undervalue the probability of a breach or loss from a breach, and they tend to underestimate the costs of such a breach. And so I just assert in the same casual way that I gave Andrew a value function, that this is a generalized politician's value function. Now, what this leads to, in my mind, is the statement that, of course, politicians control the access to the data, regardless of how positive you frame FERPA. And there's potential of purposeful uses of FERPA to limit evaluation. One of my best examples of this is actually the state of Colorado in a prior incarnation. And in a prior incarnation, the Department of Education in Colorado was asked, would you just give us the distribution of individual student learning gains from one year to another, the distribution. And their response was, no, that would be violating FERPA, and we can't give you that information. Okay. Somebody who knows FERPA better than I can explain how that violates FERPA. And the alternative is what I would put in the category, if this is my researcher perspective, of malicious actions that we see. One is, as you look around states and have these discussions across states, you see very different interpretations of what FERPA says and made from a different state perspective. And they're pretty arbitrary. They don't have to do with what the statements are. There is the ability of people who control the access to slow and or stop access through bureaucratic hurdles. Anybody who's ever tried to get the data from the state of California might understand what I'm saying here at this time, of just one hurdle after another, announcing that, well, of course you have to go through the state IRB policy program in order to get access to the data, even if you've gone through your university's IRB program. And you say, well, how do you do that? Oh, you had to have applied a month ago to do that, and so forth. And then there's a series of what I would call impossible demands that are often made for people who aren't interested in releasing the data. One would be that the researchers indemnify the state against any possible loss, which is pretty difficult for most researchers to do. The second, which violates Stanford rules and I think most university rules, is that they want to have veto power over the release of any research data. Thirdly, they can just put a high price tag on getting access to the data. We will provide it to you for X thousands of dollars if you want. There's a spate of states now that argue that state electrons should never leave the state, that the data can only, if you have access to the data, can only be used in the state of origin, so that somebody from California cannot import the electrons from Texas, where I do a lot of work. I have to, maybe it's a balance of trade argument that I have to go there and buy hotels in Dallas. But, and then there's, as we've discussed, and Susan mentioned, state laws that in fact go quite a bit beyond FERPA. These are all issues that somehow we have to deal with because they're real and they provide the backdrop for anybody who actually wants to use administrative data for good purposes or whatever. So a few other data access issues. There are legitimate blockages of access. You know, state agencies have to at times spend a lot of time and expense preparing data in ways that are suitable to researchers. And they sometimes face bad research. And I would call that a potential legitimate problem. There are political pressures on how the data are used. And then there are the attempts recently that we've seen to degrade the data, actively degrading the data from what it might be. The best one is my quote here from Betty Rosa. Some of you may know Betty Rosa. She is the Chancellor of Schools for New York State, just elected unanimously by the Board of Regents in New York State to that position. And on her unanimous election to the state board, or the Chancellor of New York State Schools, says, if I was a parent and I was not on the Board of Regents, I would opt out at this time. Yes. Encouraging people that it produces a great externality, because the data that might come from her child taking the test has no implications for her child, but by not having the data, it has implications for whether you can use administrative data for any research purpose. And then there are active attempts, and I think at schools and some other places, to encourage giving misinformation. And then there's the sort of what I would call inadvertent degradation of data, which is mistaken views of research quality. For example, prohibitions against using any administrative data that crosses the boundary of two different tests. You can never link the tests. So when most states change the tests that they use, they sort of say you can never have really a time series of data on individuals, because that would violate good research, I guess. And then there's this incentives I say incentives to degrade. It's incentives to do other things, of which Atlanta is an example of affecting administrative data. And then there's IRB rules where, you know, every university is on their own with IRBs, and some of them think that secondary data analysis is in fact something that they have to weigh in on. So let me say, so I'm going to finish with some few smaller issues. One is I thought that there was an implication in Andrew's paper that I thought was too narrow, that it's only classroom improvement that matters. I mean, for example, as a simple example, picking up on David's comments, you might want to use administrative data to find out more about the costs of something. And so indirectly, you can eventually get everything to the classroom, but it's a stretch. Secondly, there's this theme that was at the end of David's comments that's implicit or explicit, actually, in Andrew's paper that sort of says, well, researchers are under possible sanctions and they're going to be responsible people because that's their job. And I remind some of the older people in this room of a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, which is the recent incarnation is Snowden, where these are responsible people who, in fact, release data and with considerable damage in both cases. You might argue whether it's legitimate or not. And there's also the question that I think we have to spend more time thinking about prevention than enforcement. Enforcement of the guy who, giving a ticket to the guy who's in an accident after he runs the stop sign has some value, and the value of research partnerships is essentially the big gap between the difference between legality and reality. If it's legal to use the data, but the people who control the data don't want you to use it, you're not going to use it. That's so conclusions. We've learned a lot, dramatic changes in what we know and don't know. Data is power. And then there's a problem on the other side of diverse groups that are united around a simple theme, and that is the government shouldn't know anything about anybody. And this includes people on the far right and the far left who have come together in common, I guess in this political age, lots of things are possible, but they've come together to make data access more difficult. In my mind, the future of the U.S. depends on getting it right. And that simple apocalyptic kind of statement is where I'd like to leave it.
Very good. Well, my role, I think, is to be a little bit of a curmudgeon. I guess I should start out by saying I admire Andrew, and he wrote a wonderful paper, which I also want to commend all of you to pay attention to. And of course, I admire my colleague David, who is an eternal source of not only support, but optimism at IPR. Rick was a little bit more skeptical, and I'm going to, because I also admire Rick, I'm going to follow in his footsteps somewhat in this talk. The first thing that I tend to want to say whenever I'm asked to talk about big data is that it's useful to understand what you mean by big data before trying to prescribe whether you think it's good or bad or the ways in which it's good or bad. And big data is very much in the definition is very much in flux. You could be talking about census data like state longitudinal data systems, or something much, potentially much larger, like all the keystrokes and latencies in a school for all the kids who work on the computer all the time. We could be talking about mixtures of different types of data. We could be talked about data collected and stored in different formats and in different locations. And just what you mean sort of has a big impact on what you think the potential of big data may be. Like half of the universities in the country, Northwestern has a big data initiative, and when we settled on a definition of big data, it became just more or different data than you were used to dealing with. Which meant that big data for astronomy and big data for psychology were really quite different things. So just remind us of that. I'm going to take a risk here, and mostly to provoke discussion. I'm not sure I 100% believe everything I'm going to say, but I'd like to sort of at least give you some things to argue about later by saying that I think big data is very well suited to some things, it's maybe well suited to other things, and not very well suited to yet other things. So in terms of providing direct descriptions of populations, or at least some populations, measuring populations, big data in the form of administrative data and censuses of various kinds is very well suited. After all, you know, statistics essentially has its origin and its name, in fact, from the activity of describing states by censuses. It's also incredibly useful to provide meaningful characterizations of subpopulations. That's something that is often difficult to do with general purpose surveys, and it may be really the big data in the form of censuses may come close to being the only way to do that well. Of course, as David mentioned, I think supporting the design of targeted studies for better inferences to well-defined populations, that is supporting design for external validity, is something that big data also has an important role for. In much of research, we talk about external validity in a very vague way, without reference to a population. And how you can talk about generalization without talking about generalization to what, I think, has been the failure to talk about to what has been a big problem for education research and for other kinds of research. Data about potential inference populations is one of the ways we can design better studies to infer to them. And then the next point was supposed to say supporting analysis for external validity. In many cases, the population to which inferences are desired isn't even defined very well, or defined ahead of the design of the data collection. Some of us, there's a big cottage industry now of working on better methods both to design studies for generalization and also for analysis of studies to generalize to different inference populations, and that's impossible without big data. I think another thing that big data is incredibly well suited for is understanding population parameters for designing complex studies, whether they're experiments or quasi-experiments or even surveys. It really helps to know a lot about the population you're studying in order to design a targeted study. And of course, we've already heard about reducing the cost of design studies, whether they're experiments or quasi-experiments or even surveys. All of those things, and it's almost a no-brainer that big data is well suited to do. It may be well suited to do some other things. I think continuous monitoring of student progress and student process in schools, as Andrew was suggesting, has enormous potential. This has the potential to give us real-time research on teaching and learning, and actually, for the first time, bring continuous improvement in a serious way to education. And I'll just remind everybody that it was in the early part of the 20th century that William S. Gray introduced the revolutionary idea that people trying to teach reading to students in schools ought to test them occasionally to see how well they could read in an objective way. That seems unremarkable now. I can imagine that in 50 years